We approach the second anniversary of the deadly terrorist attacks of October 7, 2023 by Hamas terrorists against Israel. As this anniversary approach, the sympathy and solidarity for the Jewish state, which was expressed in the following months and year, is starting to wear very thin. Instead of helping Israel to rescue the remaining 48 hostages, defeat Hamas and end the war, many EU member states are instead accusing Israel of war crimes and even genocide. In this edition of the European report, we are going to discuss how we ended up in this situation and what the calls for sanctions and boycotts against Israel means for EU-Israel relations, the war in Gaza, and the future of the Middle East. With me in the studio today here in the European Parliament, we have MEP Ivars Ijabs from Latvia, member of the Renew Group, even vice chairman.
Yes.
And as so many times before, Tomas Sandell, founding director of the European Coalition for Israel. My name is Yossi Lempkowicz from European Jewish Press and Europe-Israel Press Association. This is the European report. MEP Ijabs, I will start with you. You heard my introduction where I implied that sympathies for Israel in the ongoing war in Gaza is shifting away from the fate of the 48 hostages still captive by Hamas to the issue of humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Of course, this is understandable. The situation is quite dire, but it's also in line with the strategy of Hamas. The more civilian casualties, the better for the overall strategy for Hamas. Is this a fair assessment? And if so, how would you explain this shift in attention and solidarity towards Israel since the 7th of October?
Thank you very much, and thanks first of all for having me. I would say that let me start with the fact that there is still and there is a persistent sympathy with the Jewish state in the European Parliament. There have been, of course, some changes in political rhetorics of some politicians and some political groups, but nevertheless, I think that the most reasonable people in Brussels and in the national capitals understand that Israel's right to existence and fighting for its existence stays not for discussion, and this is really a priority. As for the developments you mentioned just now, I think that those approaches about sanctions, boycotts, and they are just simply counterproductive. Because, I mean, in that way, Europe is just showing its weakness. For example, well, I have been working with science innovation-related files in the European Parliament, and as you probably know, one of the things that have been discussed by some people is, well, boycotting Israeli participants from Horizon and so on and so forth. But we all know that the most big impact of that would be on the Europe itself, because Israel is very good. We have to work with Israelis. And of course, also because this is, let's be frank, this is about putting things in perspective. We are legitimately worried about humanitarian situation in Gaza. And of course, also that we have to discuss that with the Israeli government and with NGOs and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, we should have the broader perspective. We all know, just as you said, that it started with October the 7th, 2023, which was basically the first act, if you want, of genocide from the Hamas side. And what we are dealing with there is not just some kind of a local conflict. This is really a murderous cult which we are dealing with in Hamas. And I'm coming from Latvia, as you might know. What we perceive very vividly is this, if you want, certain alliance or axis of evil, where Iran is one of the participants with its leg in Hamas, but also, of course, Putin's Russia and all the other anti-Western, anti-democratic forces are standing behind that. And in that sense, well, we can discuss details, but in general terms, in broader perspective, the fight that the state of Israel is fighting with Hamas is our common fight, fight against common enemies.
Tomas Sandell, you have been following the EU-Israel relations for almost 25 years. How do you, would you describe the current climate in EU-Israel relations? Is Israel slowly losing the support of Europe, or the current criticism from some EU member states is something which we have seen before? Is it different from the past? We remember that for years Israel was excluded from the EU-Israel Association Council. It didn't happen for 10 years. There was always criticism of Israel in the EU regarding the Palestinian issue. But is it now even, I would say, different?
Well, thank you, and thank you to MEP Ijabs. I should say he stole most of my talking points already in his introductory remarks, because he said it so wisely that we are nowhere near a crisis in EU-Israel relations. People of goodwill, people in the center, if we disregard the extremes, understands what Israel is facing. If I look at EU-Israel relations over a period of 25 years, I would characterize the first 10 years as a rather passive support of Israel. The Israel delegation, it's quite interesting. It would have a chair that would not call together the delegation, and simply they chose someone who would have a hostile approach to Israel, and that way it didn't have any leverage. That changed, I would say, around 15 years ago. So for the last 15 years, we have had active delegations who have promoted good relations between Europe and Israel. And I think the last 10 years could be considered as exceptionally warm and supportive in relations to Israel. If we look at this commission, which we have now, this parliament, the president in the respective institutions, I could not think of anyone more fair and warm and supportive to the Jewish cause. What is different now, and this I want to emphasize, is that the external influence, you mentioned about the axis of evil with China, Russia, Iran, but also the hybrid warfare that we are experiencing inside Europe is very different from what was the case 15 years ago. I think, just to give an example, if you look at the uprising on the college campuses after October 7, that we can see the conformity both in messaging and even the colors of the tents and everything. We see that this is not spontaneous. And we have to keep this in mind at this very difficult time. We'll be facing a war on European soil. We cannot play around. And we have to be able to call things for what they are. This is, to a great extent, external interference, and we should call it out here in the European Parliament.
MEP Ijabs, Israel remains a divisive issue inside the European Parliament, but also among EU member states. And for example, your country, Latvia, is considered as a very close country, like for Israel, very close relations. We have seen that recently 2 visits in Riga by Foreign Minister of Israel and the President of Israel. We have seen your foreign minister, Baipa Braza, saying that reaffirming Latvia's full support for Israel's right to self-defense. But how would you characterize now the attitudes towards Israel inside your group, political group, the Renew group, which you are a member, and your native country, Latvia, for this matter? What is more important for an MEP, the party line, the national alignment, or your personal convictions? It's important because they're probably different.
Sure. Well, in my case, I have to say that there are no significant differences because, of course, well, the primarily thing, just as you asked, is, of course, your individual conscience, your individual conviction, because we are elected on a free mandate and we are responsible for our own deeds to the electorate. But as for the Latvian perspective, yes, of course, because there are not just historical experiences we have had in common with the State of Israel, but also certain strategic challenges, if you want. Because, for example, Israel can serve for us as a role model in how to defend yourself in a rather particular geopolitical situation. I mean, the State of Israel has been doing that ever since 1940s, even if not even before that. And there is a lot of experience to behave, and also how to sustain a vivid democracy in such a situation, which is a big challenge because we all know those problematic neighbors and how do they impact the domestic policies. As for the Renew group in the European Parliament, we have discussions on this, but I think that the main position is, of course, that we are for Israel's right to self-defense. And, well, what comes after that, what questions should be discussed and so on and so forth, this is another question, but nevertheless, we belong to that central, if you want, position of the European Parliament, which was just mentioned by Mr. Sandell, which is constructive, which understands the complexity of the situation, and is capable, again, of putting this whole thing in a broader perspective. How did it all begin? What has the Israeli state been doing regarding the humanitarian assistance to Gaza? All those questions are being discussed in a very frank manner, and in that sense, I think that you can rely, of course, also on us in that sense. Well, if you ask about the Latvian experiences, yes, we have been always happy to receive your leadership in Latvia, also going to Israel when it's possible, and to visit this really vibrant and extremely interesting country.
And as I know, Latvia rejected the idea of recognition of a Palestinian state for the moment because it would be counterproductive.
Well, yeah, we all know that we are approaching this issue in the UN General Assembly, but yes, nevertheless, I think that my state chose really the right way to approach this, because right now I don't see anything to recognize in that situation. And there is also no clear way how this would help the situation. Well, if it's done by, we know that our French colleagues are approaching this and so on and so forth. Some member states have already done it. Well, how does that help to solve the situation in Gaza?
Now, let's speak about the question of sanctions against Israel that are on the table for the moment. For both of you, Tomas, Sandell and MEP Ijabs, what effect do you think EU trade sanctions would have on Israel? Is it possible to remain friendly with the Jewish state if the European Union chooses to apply punitive measures against Israel and even sanction government ministers, a measure that is on the table? Are there any risk of consequences, bad consequences for the European Union, which is partly dependent on Israel's intelligence sharing, security cooperation, technology, you just mentioned it. Can the European Union afford to jeopardize these relations? Tomas Sandell.
Well, I listened to an Israeli diplomat recently, and he was referring to Brussels echo chambers, and he said, you know, European Parliament, the European Commission, he didn't feel that they were the most sympathetic necessarily, but he says when he goes to NATO, it's like going from Ramallah to Jerusalem, because anyone who does know anything about security and defense, they realize what a constructive role Israel is playing in the European defense structure. And it is clear to everyone, and I think every defense ministry in Europe would be increasingly worried if our cooperation with Israel would in any way be harmed, because it wouldn't in the first place harm Israel, but it would really harm European defense. And I'm speaking here even as a Finn, looking at our long border and our hoping to have a David Sling in Finland in the near future. So why should we shoot ourselves in the foot? It all comes back to this hybrid warfare and cognitive warfare that I spoke about earlier. And it's just very interesting if we heard in the background, even during this show, people coming in and shouting, "Stop the genocide." And I think this is just an expression to what so many people are experiencing in public spaces today, college campuses. We just had a conference about how Jewish students are very anxious of returning to school because of the growing anti-Semitism. But also I know for example, the parliament in Stockholm just had to renew its security completely because of people just, it's like a street parliament. Instead of sitting down, as you said very rightly, Mr. Ijabs, to look constructively at the situation, look at the big picture, not shy away from anything. And yes, there is a crisis in Gaza. We have to find ways of solving it. But at the same time, sanctions and boycotts are not the right way.
Maybe they don't know the context. For example, many people don't know the context, how we came to this. Remember, 1948, rejection by the Arabs of a Palestinian state at the time, So people need to know the context and the history.
And I would also add that if we look at opposition to Israel in three phases, a military perspective, they realized they couldn't defeat Israel military. Then the terrorists, they realized that would sooner or later would backfire. Now we are in this international lawfare phase where the weapons are very different. And this is just one expression of that, to try to weaken Israel, to try to demonize, but we should not give in to that.
MEP Ijabs, the same question for you regarding...
Well, the sanctions, just as I said, this would be a way for the EU to harm itself, first of all, because it would be, looking at what's happening, especially during these last days, how the situation is developing in Gaza City and so on and so forth, it would be extremely naive to think that we, with our sanctions, would somehow considerably change the strategic framework of the Israeli government. How do they approach the situation in Gaza? So that would be just a symbolic thing. And just like the colleague told us, in Europe we really deal, and this started long before October the 7th, with this strange alliance between the far left and the Islamists. And this is what we often observe, in that sense that we really see people who are basically working to defend this terrorist organization with an obvious aim to split Europe as well, because we all know that there is no single approach to this problem in the EU itself. And this is how we are still struggling with formulating the European common security and foreign policy, even in times like turbulent as this, like, well, what we are experiencing with the Russian full-scale aggression in Ukraine, but also the situation in the Middle East.
Tomas Sandell, if you would be in a position to advise the Israeli government with the situation, current challenges, especially in EU-Israel relations, what would be your advice and what would be your message for the EU leadership, for President von der Leyen, for High Representative Kaja Kallas? What would you tell them, today?
Yes, coming back to zooming out and looking at the big picture, I think we are in obviously the most critical security situation after the Second World War. This is a time when we can't be divided, and we know that there are forces, we can name them by name, China, Russia, others, who are trying to sow division within Europe, and to some extent they are succeeding. But at the same time, the good thing is I don't think I have to give any advice to the people you mentioned, because I think they are dealing with the situation very calmly and consistently in a good and constructive way. And that is to emphasize that we should stand united within Europe, but I also think transatlantically, despite the problems we have, it's very important that the US and Europe would stand united. And then the third leg, and I was reminded by a German colleague just yesterday, he said CDU, their youth organization, used to have a flag where they had the German flag, the European flag, the US flag, and the Israeli flag, just to symbolize that, we have we stand on similar roots, we have similar values, and we should stick together and not be divided. When it comes to Israel, I would say, don't give up on Europe. Don't give up on Europe. Engage, take the European opinion seriously, and we need each other. And there are many more friends in Europe than the perception is in Israel by and large.
And on growing anti-Semitism, which is fueled by what's happening in the Middle East, with people protesting, but also we see almost every day anti-Semitic incidents in several European countries, attacks against Israelis in Europe, like tourists. So what would you advise also Europe to counter this phenomenon?
I think Europe needs to look at the big picture. To the extent that we amplify Hamas talking points, this is eventually going to happen. It's going to be it's going to influence the whole society and will make it an unsafe place for Jews in Europe. But I think also that the European Commission, they get this.
MEP Ijabs, if I look into the next few months in the European Parliament, of course, it will be a very busy period where you mentioned the ongoing war in Ukraine will have a top priority. But how important do you think EU-Israel relations are in this bigger picture? Is there currently too much focus on and attention on Israel, or perhaps too little? Why is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict of interest for the EU in first place, what we see every day?
Because simply saying Israel is a very close ally, and we have been always in many ways looking to the fates and the developments in the Jewish state. But as for the next few months, I think that what is the most important thing is to keep all the communication channels open. Don't give up on Europe, please, because this is really important. Because, well, there have been certain developments, but nevertheless, the mainstream and I think the most well-intentioned people really support Israel's right to self-defense, even in a very complicated situations, just like the current one we are observing. Of course, there will be a lot of talk and a lot of interest in the humanitarian situation in Gaza, especially because, as we all know, the human rights is part of the European DNA. But what we should really understand, I think, and this is what Europe also plays its part, is that Israel has to keep this soft power. I'm more or less sure about its hard power. The hard power has been shown during these last years, and we see how strong and how devoted you are to your sovereignty, to your statehood, and so on and so forth. I'm a little bit more concerned about the Israeli soft power, because we have been always looking at that country in such a problematic region, in many ways, as a role model. And that's why also I think this process should be reciprocal on both sides. We should engage in communication, explaining things, especially when we want to counter this propaganda coming from the far left, coming from different kinds of Islamist sympathizers in Europe, in many countries. So let's keep that communication open.
That's all for this month's edition of the European Report. Thank you to both MEP Ivars Ijabs and Tomas Sandell for this very interesting discussion on EU-Israel relations as we are dealing with EU threats of boycotts and sanctions. To our readers, as always, if you like our program, please feel free to share the YouTube link with your friends and colleagues. My name is Yossi Lempkowicz, and this has been the European Report. See you again next month.